New set, new cards, new common cards. Hello, I'm the Pauper guy, and today I'm going to take a look at some of the commons from the new Magic set Ikoria, Lair of Behemoths. If you're looking for a brief video talking about the top 5 prospects from Ikoria, this video ain't it. We're going to talk about a bunch of cards, what they potentially represent, and why they will or won't be seeing play. Looking at random single cards first, let's take a look at Blitz Leech. Pauper has yet to see a decent Necrotal style creature break into the format, and this one doesn't really change that since it's 6 mana. I like this card a lot since it seems like a decent improvement on cards like Blight Breath Catoplopas, and I think that Blitz Leech could stand a chance of seeing play at some point. It might die to Bolt, but having 5 power and Flash is no joke. Removal gets significantly better when it's at instant speed. Next up is Bushmeat Poacher. This is an improvement over the likes of Spark Reaper, which has a similar capability but only has 3 toughness and costs 3 mana to activate its ability. Spark Reaper has, unsurprisingly, seen 0 play, but I think Bushmeat Poacher is still interesting. I think it's notable that Spark Reaper came out very recently in War of the Spark, was the first creature at common to have an ability like this, and since then, there have been 2 more creatures released that do similar things. It wouldn't surprise me if we see this mechanic again, and if we keep getting incremental improvements to it, we might eventually see it in a decent Pauper deck. Fire Prophecy is so close to being really good. Having played around with red control a bunch via Mono-Red Monarch lately, I can say that this card would absolutely be playable if the card it sent to the bottom of the library was discarded instead. There are tons of ways to take advantage of discard mechanics in Pauper, but nothing that meaningfully interacts with the bottom of your library. Forbidden Friendship is a bit of a weird card. It's kind of like a marginally better dragon fodder, assuming that you don't mind your tokens not being goblins. It's definitely meant to run alongside Of One Mind, which is potentially a new Thoughtcast if we can find a way to play it for its reduced cost reliably, but I won't be holding my breath over either of these cards. Gust of Wind is the cheapest bounce spell that cantrips that we've seen up until this point, assuming that you can keep a creature with flying on the board, which is pretty easy. The only thing that really holds this card back is the fact that it's a sorcery, which I think will unfortunately keep it from seeing any meaningful play. Bounce spells are a form of control or removal, both of which get significantly worse when you have to play them at sorcery speed. Seeing as Fervent Strike and Storm Strike don't see any play, I don't expect that Heightened Reflexes will either. It is interesting in that it's a combat trick that leaves behind permanent First Strike on its target, but the only deck that would even begin to consider this card is Mono-White Heroic, and it's not going to be playing red cards anytime soon. Keep Safe is an interesting mixture of Turn Aside and Confound. I've noticed that Magic's design team has been pretty careful about any new counter magic being decent when it costs 2 mana or less. As much as I love cards that cantrip, I don't see this being played over Turn Aside. Decks that care about their creatures, or permanents, enough to devote other cards to protecting them are typically more concerned with being able to hold open enough mana to play those said protective spells. Lava Serpent is not a good card by any stretch of the imagination, but it is exactly the sort of tool that Reanimator decks would like to see. Well, that and literally any other reanimation spell in black. Seriously, why does white have 3 reanimate spells and black has only 1? Can we just get Zombified downshifted? Please? Light of Hope is a very interesting card. Before we get too excited about a modal card in Pauper that might actually be good, let's consider a few things first. First, in order for this card to see play, it must have at least one mode that a deck will always be interested in using. I don't think there are many decks that would put this card in main board to simply gain 4 life or destroy enchantments, but a deck like Mono-White Heroic would enjoy using the 3rd mode consistently. Second, would that deck, in this case Mono-White Heroic, be interested in sometimes using the other 2 modes, and do those modes matter enough to play this card over other cards? I haven't played Mono-White Heroic enough to answer this question definitively, but if it struggles with matchups like Burn or Bogles, then this card might be worth it. Third, if this card is instead being considered as a sideboard card, is it better than our other sideboard options? I have to think that it probably isn't. Sideboard cards are typically selected because they are brutally strong at doing the one thing that they do, and I don't think that that's the case here. I could be wrong, and maybe we'll see this card make its way into Mono-White Heroic sideboard. I'm sure that some people will at least try it out, so we'll know for certain before too long. The card most likely to see play in existing decks is probably Ram Through. This is a very tempting card for decks like Bogles to use, since they run cards like Armadillo Cloak and Rancor that grant trample. These decks will probably appreciate a way to interact with opponents' creatures that pose a problem, like Well-Wisher or Stonehorn Dignitary, or as an alternative win condition to attacking, since the creature and Bogles do get big enough to kill in one hit. Since I have seen many people ask about it, I will mention that if the enemy creature gets flickered or invalidated as a target in any way, the excess damage from the spell does not trample through like it would in combat, since the spell fizzles completely. This means that it is definitely not a guaranteed solution to Flickertron, but it remains a possibility. The fact that Ram Through is an instant is what makes it good, and why I expect it will see play. Serrated Scorpion is a very well-priced, well-statted card that seems like it's looking for a combo to fit into. Being a 1/2 for 1 mana that has a pretty good death trigger makes it something kinda new to Pauper. I don't think that it's going to find a home easily, but it might see use alongside something like Tethmost High Priest, or maybe in some kind of Aristocrats deck. Solid Footing is another card that almost makes the cut, but not quite. As some have been quick to point out, this card has the potential to make the Tireless Tribe combo much more consistent and lethal, except that it requires the enchanted creature to have Vigilance. Even so, it's a cheap and reasonable card at 1 mana, considering that it has Flash. It could easily find a home somewhere, maybe alongside something like Sentinel's Eyes. Sudden Spinnerets doesn't do anything new that other combat tricks haven't done, but it does do a little bit more than most for only 1 mana. The fact that it buffs a little, gives permanent reach, and untaps the creature means that it could maybe see play in a deck similar to Mono Green Stompy as a more defensive card. Stompy itself probably wouldn't run it, since it tends to focus on pure offense, but the potential is there regardless. Survivor's Bond is a very fair mechanic at an impressive rate. Unfortunately, Pauper is not a format that plays around with fair mechanics. Even if this card just let you get any 2 creatures back for 2 mana, it probably still wouldn't see play. The thing to note here, though, is that this card is in green, and the large majority of effects that return creatures to your hand from the graveyard are in black. This doesn't mean that we'll see this card putting up results anytime soon, but it is very nice to have a little additional design space for green decks. I think that Tentative Connection is one solid step closer to us seeing some kind of scary black-red Aristocrats list. There are lots of red steel creature effects in Pauper at 3 mana, but they're too costly to be worth it. This card and Wrangle could potentially open the doors to a deck that gets to hit you with your own creatures before it sends them to the graveyard with something like Carrion Feeder. The only catch is that cost reduction requirement. 4 mana makes this card almost unplayable, so any deck that would like to run it would need more than 1 good creature with Menace in the list, which might not be so easy to find. Whisper Squad is a super cool card. It's very similar to Squadron Hawk, even though it doesn't fetch the cards right away. In the case of Squadron Hawk, you have to end up paying the 2 mana for each copy you put into play, so this card costs around the same amount of mana per body. It doesn't have the Hawks flying, but it costs 1 less mana the first time. The biggest reason that this card probably won't see play has more to do with the fact that it's in black, which typically doesn't reward a wide board state in Pauper like red and white can. It could still prove to be an interesting late-game mana sink for black decks, but I would look more seriously at other recent cards like Underworld Charger to fill that sort of role. I've saved my favorite card for last in singles, which is Excavation Mole. This is a well-priced creature, being a 3/3 with trample for 3. On top of that, it lets you self-mill for 3 when it enters the battlefield. This is exactly what Rot Raven and other similar decks have been waiting for. There have been cards like Wailing Ghoul for a long time, but Excavation Mole is much more impressive and provides a lot more board pressure being a 3/3 with trample. Alongside Satyr Wayfinder and Gorging Vulture, Golgari's self-mill strategies are getting better and better. As many of you have probably noticed, I've thus far left out 2 of Ikoria's biggest mechanics. I want to talk about each of the cards that fit into these categories together. We'll start with the new cycling cards. Ikoria introduces 7 cards that can be cycled for 1 colorless mana. This is unprecedented in that there has never been a single card in Pauper until now that cycles for 1 colorless mana, and suddenly we have 7. The closest thing that we already have is Street Wraith, which cycles for 2 life. But why should we care about this? Well, Ikoria also gives us some cards with effects that trigger when you cycle a card. Drannith Stinger and Drannith Healer are pretty well statted for their cost and also happen to have cycling themselves. But dealing 1 damage to an opponent or gaining 1 life doesn't seem like a big enough effect to be worth it. And the real letdown here is that the other 5 cycling cards are bad. They're overcosted cards with weak effects that wouldn't be used outside of their cycling ability. This includes Memory Leak, which I've seen some talk about. I don't think that Castigate is worth paying if it costs 3 mana, even if it allows you to choose a card in their graveyard. 3 mana is way too much for a sorcery card that does nothing to the board state. Instead of using these 5 cards that are worthless outside of their 1 colorless cycling cost, we would be better off browsing through the rest of Pauper's cycling cards, some of which have decent triggered cycling effects or cycle for 1 colored mana. There are 2 other cards in the set that benefit from use cycling cards, but they fall prey to what I call the rule of 3. They both have 3 or less toughness, cost 3 or more mana, and get no immediate value when played, like from an enters the battlefield effect. This means that they die to Lightning Bolt, one of the cornerstone cards of the format. The mana efficiency tempo swing of having a 3 mana play get blown out by a 1 mana play can be pretty harsh. And even if it's not a Lightning Bolt, there are plenty of other very cheap and very efficient removal cards in Pauper, like Doomblade, Tragic Slip, Snuff Out, Defile, Scred. The list just goes on and on. Playing a creature that violates the rule of 3 is almost always a bad idea, which is why I don't think that Snare Tactician and Prickly Marmoset will ever see play. Another example of this outside of cycling cards is Spell Eater Wolverine. A 3-2 with Double Strike, even most of the time, for 3 mana, might be fine if it didn't have to withstand Pauper's crazy selection of amazing removal. Finally, we arrive at the new star mechanic of Ikoria, Mutate. I want to talk about it and the mechanics surrounding it before moving on to the creatures themselves, so I don't have to repeat myself. Mutate is going to struggle to find a new place in Pauper since it will be a little vulnerable to the strong removal floating around. Anytime you allow your opponent to remove 2 of your cards with one of theirs, you are taking a serious risk. This is why most auras that buff creatures don't see a lot of play, despite being a mana-efficient way to create a strong threat. The exceptions to this, of course, include Bogles, which uses hexproof creatures that can't be directly targeted by removal. Stompy and Mono-White Heroic also use some auras and buff spells, but they have combat tricks and protection spells to back them up. Despite this, there is still some potential for Mutate. Getting 2 for 1 by a removal spell can happen in 2 different ways. When the aura or mutate creature is on the stack, or after it's resolved. Mutate stands a chance of seeing play because it addresses both of these 2 scenarios in different ways. Let's take a look at Migratory Greathorn as an example. If a removal spell is played targeting the creature already in play, this will fizzle the mutate effect, but the creature on the stack, in this case Migratory Greathorn, will still come into play. This means that your opponent has made a 1-for-1 trade with one of your creatures, and you got to play a 3-4 creature for 3 mana, which is a very good rate. Unfortunately, you don't get the mutate trigger effect, which in this case is fetching a basic land and putting it into play tapped. If your opponent uses removal to kill the Migratory Greathorn after it has already mutated, it will kill both the creature on top and underneath, since they are functionally one creature at this point. But the mutate's trigger effect will already be on the stack or resolved. This means that they got to complete a 2-for-1 trade in terms of cards, but you got to resolve a triggered ability when the mutated creature came into play. In either of these situations, you get some form of value, and don't get completely blown out. Another thing I want to keep in mind as we look at these mutate cards has to do with where we will be getting the non-human creatures that act as the target for the mutate effect. Pauper is filled with decent aristocrat-style cards that generate extra creature tokens or come back to the battlefield in extra time. This means that we have a variety of options to avoid using 2 full cards in order to play a mutated creature. My first thought was something along the lines of Colony Garden, which is a non-basic land that gives you a 0/1 plant token when it comes into play. This and cards like Nest Invader give us free targets for mutate, while also still acting as their own cards independently. Another option is hexproof creatures, like Slippery Bogle or Silhana Ledgewalker. These could easily be used as mutate targets, especially since mutated creatures retain all of the combined abilities of all the creatures in the mutation stack. This means that a mutated creature like Migratory Greathorn would get to keep the hexproof and evasion of Silhana Ledgewalker, while still getting to be a 3-4 since we can choose either creature to be the one that sits on top. Our options don't stop with tokens and hexproof, however. Any decent cheap creature that gets value when it enters the battlefield, like Thraben Inspector or Arboreal Grazer, would make fine targets. The best mutation target that I have thought of so far would have to be Young Wolf. This is because it is cheap to play at 1 mana, and will grant its Undying ability to whatever creature it mutates into. Even more impressively, if the mutated creature is killed after it has successfully merged with Young Wolf, both Young Wolf and the other creature in the mutation stack will come back into play with a +1/+1 counter, separated from one another. This is incredible because it puts you into a good position, regardless of when or if your opponent uses a piece of removal. If they kill Young Wolf while the mutate creature is on the stack, Young Wolf comes back as a 2/2, and you can still get the decent stats on the mutate creature, but no mutate trigger. If they wait to kill the creature until after it is mutated, you get the mutate trigger, plus both a 2/2 Young Wolf and a slightly bigger mutate creature. If your opponent says fuck it and refuses to try and interact with this whole mess, then I take that as a victory as well. From the opponent's side, the best way to deal with this particular issue would probably be Journey to Nowhere, which would just take away both creatures and avoid the Undying trigger altogether. Even in that case, though, the Mutate player has still gotten the Mutate triggered effect, so it's not a total loss. God help the Journey player if it gets bounced or destroyed, since when a mutated creature returns to play from exile, this includes flicker effects, it returns as two separated creatures, similar to the Undying situation. And one last important thing to keep in mind is that mutated creatures do not gain Summoning Sickness. This means that if the target host creature can attack during your turn, you can mutate it first and still attack with a newly combined mutated creature. Okay, all of this is important, but I swear I'm done. Try to keep in mind everything we just talked about while we look at these new mutate creatures. Since I've already mentioned it, let's start with Migratory Greathorn. I think this is probably the most likely to see play of the 5 mutate creatures. A 3/4 for 3 mana with a decent triggered effect is nothing to laugh at. Besides the examples I gave with Young Wolf earlier, I could see this getting played in a green deck that is trying to ramp into big plays. It could easily be played on turn 2 on top of an Arboreal Grazer, Elvish Pioneer, or some kind of mana dork to lead into having 5 mana available on turn 3. I really like the stats, cost, and effect on this card. I'm not sure exactly where it fits yet, but I really look forward to brewing with it. Cavern Whisperer seems like a fine card, but I'm not sure exactly where it will fit in. If we view it as a 4/4 for 4 mana with Menace that has your opponent discard a card, then it seems like a decent creature. I could see it fitting into a mono-black control shell, but I'm not sure that it will pair well with the existing available mutate targets, since most modern mono-black control lists tend to run creatures that are at least 3 mana. Cavern Whisperer seems like it would better pair with cards like Ravenous Rats or Dusk Legion Zealot, both of which have kind of fallen out of favor. On the other hand, this card would have plenty of decent targets in an Aristocrats deck, especially since those decks are usually black and some other color. However, from what I've seen of Aristocrat lists, they tend to keep a low mana curve, and I don't know if they would be interested in making a big play like this one at 4 mana. They also tend to lean towards being aggressive, so I'm not sure that they would care about the discard mutate trigger. It could still be a decent tempo play if the host creature isn't killed with mutate on the stack, since Cavern Whisperer would be coming into play as a 4/4 menace with haste. Regardless of the situation or deck that this ends up in, I think that Cavern Whisperer has some potential and we should keep an eye on it. While it may be the most straightforward, I think that Vole Paquet is probably the weakest of the mutate creatures. Its mutate triggered ability doesn't get you immediate value like the other 4 do, meaning that if your opponent waits for the mutation to resolve and then uses 1 piece of removal, you are left with 0 value and a bad 1-for-2 trade. If you can safely resolve the mutation, then getting a 3/4 flying with haste for 3 mana is pretty decent, but Pauper is filled with much more dangerous aggro things you can do with 2 cards and 3 to 4 mana. I can kind of envision this card in a mono-white aggro deck that is both tall and wide. White has been getting some decent cheap threats lately, like Martyr Soul and Daybreak Chimera. All 3 of these cards like to have a lot of smaller creatures to go with them, so maybe when combined all together, we'll see a new white aggro deck emerge. Dreamtail Heron is kind of like an upgraded Vole Paquet. It's also a 3/4 flying creature, but it draws you a card when it mutates and costs 1 more mana. I think that paying 4 mana for a 3/4 flying haste that draws a card is a fine rate, but honestly I have no idea what deck this would fit into. Ninja of the Deep Hours will usually be better at interacting with small enter-the-battlefield effect creatures, especially since you get the original creature back to your hand, and Ninja costs half the mana to use. This means that Dreamtail Heron would need to find a new place for itself in an archetype or deck that doesn't exist yet, and I'm not sure what that is. Cloudpiercer, just like Dreamtail Heron and Cavern Whisperer, seems like a pretty good card for its cost, but I have no idea where it could fit in. Red, as a color in Pauper, is typically best used for aggro or tempo, even when paired with another color. 4 mana, even for a 5/4 body with haste, is more mana than those types of decks want to commit to 1 card. The higher mana cost, reach, and the discard draw effect means that it could fit into some kind of mid-range or control deck, but not close to anything that already exists. And before anybody gets their hopes up about a new discard ability in red, spending 4 mana to get it means that this card won't go well with madness effects. Despite that, it could easily find some new place in a deck that can provide mutate targets and doesn't mind going a little slower. The hard part will be finding a deck that appreciates all of its features: the reach, the 5/4 body, 4 mana cost, and the discard draw. Overall, I'm more excited about the cards we're getting from Ikoria than I am from most sets. I especially look forward to brewing with the mutate cards, since they'll provide a challenge in terms of providing proper setup, but also have a decent payoff. I covered all the cards that I think are interesting enough to talk about. Sorry, suffocating fumes, I'm not impressed. But if I left out something that you think I shouldn't have, Let me know in a comment below. I'm always interested in discussing Pauper and the cards that make up the format. That's all I've got for today. Please like and subscribe if you'd like to see more Magic the Gathering Pauper content.